There are aircraft that changed history. And then there is this one, a machine so vast, so audacious, so deeply personal to one of the most complex minds of the 20th century, that it defies almost every category we might use to describe it. The Hughes H-4 Hercules, known to most people by a nickname its creator reportedly despised. A flying boat so large that even today, standing beside it in the museum where it rests in California, grown men fall silent. And the question that never quite goes away, the one that has followed this aircraft across 8 decades of history, is simply this: what would it have been like to actually fly in it? That is what this video is really about. Not the engineering, not the politics, not the congressional hearings, but the experience, the extraordinary, almost mythological experience of what it would have meant to board the world's largest aircraft ever built at the time, to walk its corridors, to look out through those enormous oval windows at the Pacific below, and to understand that you were inside something that had no equal anywhere on Earth. We are going to go inside the Hughes H-4 Hercules and discover what it truly was, not as a machine, but as a vision of what flight could have been. And by the end of this video, I think you will agree that what Howard Hughes was attempting to build was not just an aircraft. It was a civilization in the sky. Let us begin at the beginning. And the beginning, as with so many things connected to Howard Hughes, involves an impossible problem, an extraordinary ambition, and a war. The year is 1942. The United States has been at war for less than a year following Pearl Harbor, and the North Atlantic has become one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean on Earth. German U-boats are sinking Allied supply ships at a rate that genuinely threatens to strangle the war effort. Troops, equipment, medicine, food, all of it had to cross that ocean, and all of it was at risk the moment a ship left port. The military and the Roosevelt administration were desperate for alternatives. Someone, somewhere, needed to find a way to move massive quantities of men and material across the Atlantic without using ships. And that is when Howard Hughes entered the picture. Hughes, already famous as a pilot, a filmmaker, and a record setter, was approached along with industrialist Henry Kaiser to design and build a massive flying boat, an aircraft that could carry troops and supplies across the Atlantic above the reach of any submarine. The government contract called for 3 prototypes. The aircraft was to be enormous, capable of carrying up to 750 fully equipped troops, or 2 fully loaded Sherman tanks, across the ocean in a single flight. And Hughes, being Hughes, did not simply agree to build something large. He decided to build something that had never existed before in the history of human flight. Now here is where the story begins to take on a quality that feels almost fictional. Because Hughes did not have access to aluminum, the war effort had prioritized all available aluminum for conventional aircraft production. So Hughes was forced to build his flying boat out of birch wood, not metal, wood. Specifically, a material called Duramold, a process developed by the Haskellite Corporation that involved laminating birch veneers with a special resin under heat and pressure to create a material that was lighter than aluminum in many configurations, comparably strong. An aircraft the size of a city block, with a wingspan wider than a modern Boeing 747 by a considerable margin, built almost entirely from birchwood. Can you imagine standing on the shore in Long Beach, California, looking at this thing floating on the water and being told it was made of wood? The wingspan of the Hughes H-4 Hercules measured 97.5 meters, that is 319 feet. The fuselage was approximately 66 meters long. The aircraft stood over 9 stories tall at the top of its tail. It was powered by 8 Pratt & Whitney R 4,360 Wasp major radial engines, each producing 3,000 horsepower. 8 engines, 24,000 horsepower in total. And yet the entire structure, the vast, cathedral-like hull that housed all of this power, was built from wood. Birchwood, bonded and shaped and curved into something that looked less like an aircraft and more like an ocean liner that had learned to fly. Henry Kaiser eventually withdrew from the project. The war ended before the aircraft was completed. The government canceled funding and investigated Hughes in a series of congressional hearings that became genuinely dramatic public spectacles. Hughes accusing his accusers, defending himself with a ferocity that became legendary. He stood before the Senate War Investigating Committee in 1947 and declared, on the public record, that if the aircraft failed to fly, he would leave the country and never come back. Those words are documented history. He meant them. And this is where the first act ends. Because what happened next is one of the most extraordinary single moments in the entire history of aviation. And to understand what it meant, you need to understand what was inside that aircraft and why it was built the way it was. By late 1947, the Hughes H-4 Hercules had been completed at enormous personal expense to Howard Hughes himself, who spent approximately $18 million of his own money. Some estimates suggest more to finish it after government funding was cut. It had been moved in sections through the streets of Los Angeles by night because no road or bridge was wide enough to transport it during the day. That alone tells you something about its scale. Hughes was obsessed with it. His staff worked on it continuously. He personally supervised every detail, and when the Senate investigation was at its most hostile, when the political pressure on Hughes was at its most intense, he made a decision that would define the aircraft forever. On November 2nd, 1947, the Hughes H-4 Hercules was floated out onto the waters of Long Beach Harbor. Hughes was at the controls. The official purpose of the day was taxi testing, moving the aircraft across the water to evaluate its handling at speed. Journalists had been invited, newsreel cameras were rolling. Hughes had brought a small group of observers aboard, including some of his engineers and a few members of the press. What none of them fully expected, or what some of them may not have expected, was what happened on the third taxi run. Hughes advanced the throttles on all 8 engines. The aircraft accelerated across the water. And then, at approximately 70 miles per hour, the H-4 lifted off the surface of Long Beach Harbor. It climbed to about 70 feet above the water. It flew for approximately 1 mile. And then it settled back down. The entire flight lasted approximately 1 minute. 1 minute of flight. That was the only time the Hughes H-4 Hercules ever flew. Think about that for a moment. The largest flying boat ever constructed. The largest wooden aircraft ever built. A machine with a wingspan that exceeded anything that had come before it and would not be surpassed for decades. It flew once, for 1 minute, and then it was grounded forever. Not because it failed, it flew perfectly. The controls responded. The aircraft performed. It flew, but the war was over, the contracts were canceled, and there was simply no commercial or military justification to continue. Hughes had proven the point. He had silenced the Senate committee. He had won in the only way that mattered to him. But the Hercules would never fly again. What followed is one of the most remarkable acts of preservation, or perhaps obsession, in the history of aviation. Hughes refused to scrap the aircraft. He refused to donate it. He refused to allow it to be dismantled or studied by competitors. Instead, he kept the H-4 Inches, a specially built climate-controlled hangar in Long Beach, California, where a dedicated maintenance crew of 300 men continued to work on it, keeping it in a state of perfect readiness for nearly 30 years, until Howard Hughes died in 1976. 30 years of maintaining an aircraft that flew once, that would never fly again, that existed in a kind of limbo between monument and machine. The crew reportedly kept the engines running periodically to prevent deterioration. Every system was maintained. Every surface was polished. It was as if Hughes believed, or needed to believe, that the Hercules might one day take to the sky again. And here is where the story becomes something more than aviation history. Because when you walk through the reconstructed interior of the H-4, when you study the original plans and the surviving documentation, you begin to understand that this aircraft was not simply a transport vehicle. It was an expression of a vision of what air travel could be. An enormously ambitious, deeply personal vision of what it meant to cross an ocean in the sky. The passenger cabin of the Hughes H-4 Hercules was designed to carry a large number of people in a space that was, by the standards of any aircraft before or since at the time, extraordinary in its proportions. The lower deck alone was wide enough that passengers would not have felt they were inside an aircraft at all. They would have felt they were inside a large, moving room. The ceiling height in the main cabin area was sufficient for a person to stand fully upright and move freely, without the crouching or angling that characterized virtually every other aircraft of the period. The windows were large oval openings that provided a genuine panoramic view of the ocean below and the sky around the aircraft. The natural light that would have entered through those windows on a clear day over the Pacific would have been remarkable, luminous, salt bright, the kind of light that makes you feel simultaneously very small and very alive. The aircraft was divided across two decks. The upper deck, behind the flight deck, was accessible to passengers and contained areas that, in the original design concepts, would have served as observation and social spaces. This was an era in which flying boats were understood not merely as transportation but as experiences. The Boeing 314 Clipper, the Short Empire, the Sikorsky S-42, these aircraft had dining rooms, sleeping berths, cocktail lounges, and dressing rooms. The long-haul flying boat crossing was understood to be an event, a journey with its own rituals and pleasures, not a commute. Hughes, who understood luxury intuitively and had experienced it in every form, designed the H-4 with that tradition in mind, scaled up to dimensions that no other aircraft of any kind had approached. What would it have felt like to sit in that main cabin, looking out through those oval windows, 8 engines filling the air with a deep, sustained thunder, the ocean below catching the light in that particular way the Pacific does in the afternoon? The sound alone would have been extraordinary, not the thin, pressurized quiet of a modern jetliner, but something far more physical, more present, a vibration that you would have felt in your chest and your feet and your hands resting on the armrest. The smell of the ocean would have come through. The light would have moved across the cabin as the aircraft banked gently. And all around you, the extraordinary knowledge that you were inside the largest thing ever to have left the surface of the earth. If you find this kind of story, the kind that takes you inside a world that no longer exists and lets you almost touch it if that matters to you, then please consider subscribing to this channel. We do this kind of deep historical journey regularly, and every subscriber genuinely helps us continue doing it. And if you know someone who loves aviation history, who remembers when flying was something different, something that meant something, share this video with them. It was made for exactly that kind of person. Now let us talk about the third dimension of this story. Because the Hughes H-4 Hercules is not just about what it was, it is about what it represented and why its disappearance, its retreat into that climate-controlled hangar for 35 years feels, in retrospect, like the closing of a door on a particular kind of ambition. Howard Hughes was a man who believed, genuinely and without irony, that scale was a form of argument, that if you built something large enough, perfectly enough, it would prove a point that words could not. The H-4 was his response to every critic, every senator, every person who said it could not be done. It was built from wood when they said wood would not work. It was finished when they said it would never be finished. It flew when they said it would never fly. And then it was preserved at enormous ongoing expense because Hughes could not bring himself to concede that it was over. There's something deeply poignant about those 300 maintenance workers who came to work every day for nearly 3 decades to keep an aircraft ready for a flight that would never happen. They polished the surfaces, they ran the engines, they maintained the hydraulics and the electrical systems and the wooden hull with its bonded birch veneers. They were, in a sense, keeping a dream alive, not their dream, but Hughes's dream, and they did it with a professionalism and dedication that is itself a remarkable chapter in the story. What did they talk about, those men, during those long days in the hangar? Did they believe the aircraft would fly again? Did it matter whether they believed it or not? After Hughes died in April 1976, the aircraft's future became uncertain. The Summa Corporation, which managed Hughes's estate, eventually worked with the Aero Club of Southern California and other organizations to find a permanent home for the H-4. It was finally acquired by the Evergreen Aviation and Space Museum in McMinnville, Oregon, where it has been on public display since 2001. To prepare it for display, the aircraft was moved again, in sections, again requiring the closing of roads and the removal of power lines from Long Beach to McMinnville. Today it stands in a building constructed specifically to house it, a building that had to be built around the aircraft, because no existing structure was large enough to contain it. You can visit it. You can walk beneath the wing. You can stand at the entrance to the cabin and look in. And if you do, if you ever find yourself standing there, in that enormous quiet space, looking at the birch laminated curves of the hull, and the 8 silent engines, and the windows that look out onto nothing now but a museum floor, I want you to think about what it would have felt like to be there on November 2nd, 1947, when those engines came alive and the aircraft began to move across the water. 1 minute of flight, 70 feet above the harbor, 1 mile of distance. In many ways, the most expensive and consequential 1 minute in the history of civilian aviation. Because that 1 minute proved that scale was not a fantasy. That wood could fly. That one man's obsessive, expensive, politically embattled vision could actually leave the ground. And if the world had been different, if the war had lasted longer, or if the commercial aviation industry had developed along different lines, or if the economics of the post-war world had been more favorable, there is a version of history in which the Hughes H-4 Hercules became the foundation of a new era of flying boat travel. An era in which crossing the Pacific meant boarding something that felt less like boarding an aircraft and more like boarding a ship that could fly. Enormous, unhurried, spectacular. That world did not happen. The jet age arrived instead, and it brought its own miracles. But it also brought compression, the compression of space, of time, of the experience of travel, into something efficient and predictable and, for all its speed, oddly diminished. When you can cross the ocean in 9 hours in a narrow tube at 35,000 feet, you gain time. But you lose something too. You lose the sense of the journey itself as an event. You lose the ceremony. You lose the feeling, which any passenger on a Clipper or a Solent or a Short Empire would have known, that you were doing something remarkable simply by being there. The Hughes H-4 Hercules was many things. It was a wartime transport concept that arrived too late for the war it was designed to support. It was a political statement made in wood and radial engines. It was one man's refusal to be told that something was impossible. But more than any of that, it was a vision of what flying could have been: generous, monumental, unhurried, and alive to the idea that the crossing of an ocean deserved to be an experience worth remembering. And so I leave you with a question, the kind that deserves to sit with you a little while before you answer it. If you had been one of those journalists or engineers aboard the H-4 on that November morning in 1947, seated in that vast wooden cabin as the engines built to full power and the hull began to tremble across the surface of Long Beach Harbor, and then suddenly, without warning or announcement, the ocean dropped away beneath you, and you were airborne, inside the largest aircraft ever built, soaring out over the Pacific at 70 feet, what would you have thought in that moment? What would you have felt? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this kind of story moves you, if the vanished elegance of another era of flight speaks to something real in you, then please like this video, share it with someone who would understand why it matters, and subscribe if you haven't already. We will be here in this same spirit the next time you want to go somewhere that no longer exists. The Hercules flew once, but the story of what it was